Welcome to Cyber Monday. I've got my co-host with me, Dominic Vogel. Dominic, who's going to be sitting in my seat for this episode?
Well, sitting in the hot seat today is Cindy Oxenbury. She is the founder and managing director at Canopy Privacy. And I know both you and I are really excited for all the things she's going to be talking about.
Yeah, she's going to be talking about how to build a privacy program in your organization, whether you're a big one, a medium-sized organization, or a small organization. And then, of course, the GDPR, European privacy regulation, and the North American privacy regulation as well.
Yeah, and the thing I'm really excited for that she's going to be hitting on is that whole notion of privacy by design. What does that look like? What does that mean? How do organizations plan for that? As well as that whole notion of privacy breaches. Everyone talks about data breaches. There's an interesting dovetail into privacy breaches and what that means as well. So I'm pretty stoked for the conversation.
Me too. So there's the reactive and the proactive. So let's get to the episode.
Cindy, thanks so much for taking time out today to chat with us. We're really looking forward to our conversation.
So we're talking about privacy today. What kind of information are we wanting to keep private? What are the categories of private information?
You know what, I think that's such an interesting question. It's one of the first things that I tackle when I work with an organization. They have to understand what actually is personal information, and it's not always what you think. It's not necessarily that easy to categorize. I like to look at it, there's two different pieces of personal information, if you will. Direct identifiers, so those are things that point directly to an individual, right? So when we think about that, we think about social insurance numbers, we think about driver's license numbers, first name, last name, that sort of thing can point directly to an individual. But there's also indirect identifiers. So those are the kinds of things that you might look at and you might say, well, you can't tell an individual from just a postal code. But you could tell an individual, actually 87% of the population is identifiable by postal code, date of birth, and gender. So that was a study that was done in the U.S. So when you're thinking about your organization, the first thing you have to understand is, are you collecting personal information? What are you doing with it? How are you using it? And how are you disclosing it? But before you can do any of that, you have to understand what it is actually that you're collecting.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Very interesting. So how then would you describe privacy? Can you define that for our viewers today, our business audience?
So I think one of the most important things to think about when it comes to privacy is the fact that it is an individual's right to control his or her own personal information. So when we look at the difference between privacy and security, right, when we think about privacy, it's that right of an individual. So how are we protecting that right of an individual versus once that personal information gets into an organization, how is it protected, right? Like once we get it into our hot little hands, how do we actually look after that personal information?
Which is where security starts to step in.
Absolutely. The two go hand in hand.
So you're really coming at this from a human perspective. Us as human beings have got this valuable information that we just don't want to get out there. We want to know where it is and who's using it for what purpose, right?
Absolutely, and that is our fundamental human right. We have this for our own purposes to control our information, to protect it in certain ways. And because we have to share it to get along, we're all giving away our personal information constantly right now, right? Every time you turn around, you're giving away some of your personal information. We actually do have a right to control that. We have a right to protect ourselves, but organizations have an obligation. It's a legal obligation. Everywhere you look, there's a law that says you have to protect this information. You have to protect individuals. Basically, it's around what are the ways that you can discriminate against individuals by using their personal information. That's what we need to be protected from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I like to think of it as, I want you to protect my information as an organization. When I'm losing control of it, I need to protect other individual sensitive information with that same level as a business owner.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And I think you should look at it from an organizational perspective. Look at it from the perspective of, if this was my information, how would I feel about what we're doing with this information? One of the most important things when you're talking about personal information and using it, collecting it, and disclosing it as an organization, you need to think about, will what we're doing surprise the user? And if it will surprise the user, then you're doing something wrong. You haven't informed them enough. If you haven't informed them, then you don't actually have consent, right? And the Canadian legislation is consent-based. So this idea that you have to get consent from someone if you're going to do something with the information, if you're going to disclose it, if you're going to use it in a certain way. So, I think that this kind of the backdrop of consent makes for a very different place for organizations to come at using that personal information. If someone's surprised because they didn't give consent because they didn't understand exactly what you're going to do, I think that matters.
Very little understood. And I think there's this whole regulatory legal aspect of you have to do things, otherwise there's going to be consequences. But then there's the why morally are we going to do it? And I think that is a way to differentiate your company, to take privacy seriously, educate your people, educate your clients, your customers, your shareholders, anyone whose private information you have. That can set you apart if you're proactive about it.
And I totally agree with that. And I see it more and more. And it's because personal information and privacy, some of the breaches that we've seen recently that are massive, they happen to small companies too. But the intent of an organization to protect the information is an obligation that is legal, but you're absolutely right. There's a moral and there's an ethical obligation as well for organizations. Will what you're doing pass the, top story test, right? If this was, would you be proud, right? If somebody said, well, this is what we're doing with the information, or would you be like, oh no, we do not want anybody to know about that? Then you're in a risky position, and it is about risk management, right? It's about, as an organization, what are we exposing ourselves to by not being serious about this? And as privacy has gotten more and more airtime recently,
Yep.
right? We're seeing a lot of things going on. A lot of people are actually thinking very differently about it now. More questions are being asked. So when you go into a sales call, right, if you get an objection, sometimes it's around privacy. If you can speak intelligently about that right off the bat, you're going to be able to get over that hurdle immediately and move on to the next one. So I think it's really important that organizations educate themselves and educate their staff.
And I understand that's what you help people do.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of my favorite things. I mean, training individuals. So when you asked about personal information, if your staff doesn't understand when they're working with personal information, how are they going to know they should be protecting it, right? So that is one of the first things that you need to tackle. How does your staff come at it?
And there's some really interesting, paradigms and approaches to, coming through and doing privacy right the first time rather than sort of bolting it on. There's interesting parallels between what we hear on the security side as well, in which even when we're dealing with smaller businesses, they'll say, well, we're too small. We don't need to worry about that. We're too busy doing a million other things. We'll do security later. Is that an argument that you hear a lot with smaller businesses as well, that we're doing what we can, but the privacy piece we're going to worry when we're larger? Is that a common thing that you hear?
It's funny. I used to hear that.
Yeah.
And back when I started, it's sort of 6 years now that I've been doing full-on privacy. I used to hear that a lot more. I don't hear it as much anymore. I have organizations that come to me and say, look, we're small, but we have big plans.
Yeah.
And there are lots of things we want to be doing, and we want to make sure that we get this right from the start. And it's not always easy to figure out how to do that. I can tell you a story about the first time that I was working as a privacy officer, and I was working in a startup company, limited resources, and I became the privacy officer, and I was super interested in it. Like, I was a keener. I was full-on privacy keener.
You're so excited.
I was, absolutely, and I still am. I think it's really important, and to me, it's a really interesting intersection between law and people and technology. Totally. That's what I really like. But anyways, I was working for this startup company, and we realized that we were working in the healthcare space, and we knew that we were going to have to deal with HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act in the U.S., right? And so it's for personal health information. So we knew we had a big job ahead of us, and we knew that we needed to be compliant with the Canadian legislation. So I said, well, we'll get somebody to help us. So we went out to market. We found a couple of consultants. There weren't very many. There was one here in Vancouver. There was one back east as well. So we got some quotes for a lot of money to do things, and we ended up actually working with somebody. And I realized later, when I started to do this with organizations and understand what's really needed, it wasn't at all what we needed. It was this sort of overarching big company perspective, as opposed to going into the guts of the organization and figuring out what they're doing with personal information, what kind of risks, what kind of practices do they have in place, and are they, going back to your question, Dom, about sort of embedding privacy. Privacy by design is a really, really important concept, and we're internationally, when we look at the GDPR, I think the GDPR, so first of all, some history about privacy by design. So Anne Cavokian, who used to be the privacy commissioner in Ontario, was the one who did a full-on push. She developed these 7 foundational principles, did a huge amount of work around getting this some attention and helping organizations understand what they should be doing. That has been taken by a growing kind of field of privacy engineering. People sort of like me and like others who are going into an organization saying, well, okay, we have these 7 foundational principles, and they say do X, X, and X, make sure that it's proactive instead of reactive and remedial. You want to make sure that your privacy, what you're doing for protecting personal information, isn't reactive. So you want to embed privacy into systems and processes and technology right from the beginning.
It's cheaper to do that too, isn't it?
Oh man, and you know what? And actually, one of the organizations that I worked with, they had chosen a piece of technology that was not going to allow them to do what they needed to do in order to tackle a certain market. So if you're not thinking about it from the very beginning, then you're gonna make mistakes, right? And you're going to find that there's going to be hurdles that maybe you can't overcome without a huge amount of effort and money to throw at it. So
would you say privacy by design, a key component of that is just collect less information if you can?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's limiting or minimizing the amount of information you collect or use or disclose, right? So think really carefully about what actually you need. Many organizations over-collect, think, and I've had CEOs say to me, well, we just want to collect a whole bunch of stuff and then we'll figure out what we're going to do with it later. It's the wrong approach. All you're doing is amassing risk for the organization, especially if you never get rid of that data. Right. If you keep it forever, right? It's just sitting there waiting for some kind of a breach. So yes, minimizing the information, limiting the information you're collecting and using and disclosing. You can do things like logically or physically separate the data. If you're working with sensitive information, health information, separate that maybe from other information that will identify the individual. That's really important. If you don't need to use as much detail, you can also limit or minimize the detail that you're when you're processing the information. And a really good example of that is if you think about geographically, maybe you want to know about where your customers are or your users are if you're a mobile app. Maybe you don't need the exact location. Maybe you just need the city, or maybe you just need the province even, right? Depending on what you need the data for. So you can think really carefully about that.
And it's really interesting in which, almost that strategy of, because a lot of companies will just say, well, we want to keep as much data as we can and hold it indefinitely. I know whenever we sort of broach the subject of data retention, eyes roll and say, well, what does that mean? Can't we just, backup hard drives are cheap? Can't we just hold everything forever? And interesting mindset in which, yes, data allows for great insight and be able to make more important business decisions. But on the flip side, still seeing it, especially the sensitive data, seeing it as a toxic asset. In which, like Christian was saying, being able to minimize that, and in terms of that mindset, in terms of how people are seeing privacy, from a broader perspective, do you think where are we on that sort of that continuum right now? Like, are things going to keep getting worse? Are we going to see more and more privacy breaches before things get better? Are we closer to the light? Again, I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball, but where do you think we are in the continuum right now?
Well, I really like what's happening internationally, and it's being driven by the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, right? So that really is setting the bar pretty high. And what I actually see us doing is moving closer to that standard. Right. Really, we have to. If we want the free flow of data between Canada and the EU, we need to be paying attention to that because they're not going to continue to allow it, right? So they're going to look at our legislation, and we have, a decision around adequacy for PIPEDA, which is our national legislation for private bodies, right? But there are some questions about whether or not does that actually meet the standard that they're looking for. And I think the GDPR, what it's doing is it's fundamentally the foundation for it is around the human rights. Right. So this human right to privacy and the protection of personal information, which is different from other jurisdictions, right? Other jurisdictions look at it and say, well, we're doing a balancing act between protecting personal information and our commercial interests, right? Which to me is like, stab to the heart. That's not the choice that you get to make as an organization, right? You have it is a legal obligation going back to the sort of the moral and ethical and from our own perspective, how do we feel about it when our information is being misused in some way that we didn't understand because nobody told us because they said, oh, the technology is way over your head.
Right.
Sorry, we can't explain to you how this works. Well, you know what? You better figure it out.
Exactly. And, you know, this is what's so cool about, you know, security and privacy. It's often, we like to say it's two sides of the same coin. And, you know, both work well when they're sort of working in lockstep and working together, and there's a collaborative approach. Do you often see that? Like, does privacy, and like, what does it look when it's succeeding? Like, are privacy and security working together? Because I know we've seen organizations where sort of privacy is doing their thing, security is doing their thing, and it's in a vacuum, and they could be doing it a much more effective approach if they were actually talking and working together.
Yeah.
From a security perspective, what can security professionals do to you know, have a better impression with privacy professionals and both move their agenda forward rather than working independently?
Yeah, and I feel like that's happening a little bit more. I feel like security and privacy are working together a little bit more. You know, I'm not convinced that we're there yet.
Work in progress.
Yeah, exactly. It's a work in progress, right? And so we've seen a lot with the GDPR, we've seen a lot of security professionals come at it and say, oh, well, we can take on that privacy piece as well, not really understanding that it's a very different animal, right? In the same way that I would never go and say, here, let me help you with your security. I'm like, no, I'm going to call somebody who knows what they're doing. So I think that piece is really important. But with the more organizations that I work with now, I'm working closer and closer with security professionals, right? And I think that hand-in-hand piece is becoming more and more obvious. I think privacy engineering helps a lot, right? It sort of gives privacy a framework that is fits nicely, if you will, into more of a sort of technical environment, right, in a technical discussion. So that, I think, is helping quite a bit.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you mentioned GDPR, and obviously it's for European, for a European domicile mainly. How relevant is it, or how is it relevant for companies outside of Europe, let's say particularly in North America? Why does it matter to business owners watching?
It's hugely, there's a couple of decisions that you have to make around how you're approaching the market in order to then take a look and say, well, do we need to be compliant with the GDPR, right? So the GDPR is interesting because it's about processing personal information or monitoring the behavior of individuals in the EU, right? So if you are targeting Italians for some reason, maybe the app that you have is of specific interest to them, and your website has been translated into Italian and you offer the service in euros, well, then you could be said to be targeting, and you actually need to ensure that you're complying with the GDPR in that
Targeting
case, right?
scooter drivers in Rome or something.
Yeah, exactly. You may be selling helmets. I don't know, right? So that's a big deal. So the GDPR is really important. And I think one of the challenges with the GDPR is that organizations focus on the fact that they might be fined. Right? And so a lot of the organizations that I work with, maybe they're pre-revenue, right? So maybe they're getting out there, they want to hit this market, they want to understand. But if you are subject to the GDPR, if you've determined that the territorial reach extends to what you're doing, your company's activities, not only can they fine you, but they can actually stop you from processing the information. In other words, stop your business from going ahead, right? So that's huge, and that matters. If you're not worried about a fine because it's based on your international turnover, you need to be worried about the fact that they could stop you from doing your business.
So they're pretty serious about the consequences, it sounds like.
Oh yes, they're extremely serious.
Is that an element that's not as widely published? Because I know when you're reading about GDPR and GDPR, a lot of the sort of the dialogue seems to be centered around fines. Very little, at least I've ever come across that notion that they have the ability to sort of stop that business cold in its tracks.
Yeah.
Is that an overlooked element?
Absolutely, because people are worried about fines, right? When you think about 4% of your sort of worldwide turnover, that can be a huge number. And we're going to see that, right, for some of these big organizations who haven't been paying attention. But that's what most people focus on is the money, right? But if you forget about the fact that you won't even get a chance to start making any money because they're going to say, no, you can't do what you're doing, right?
Neither side of that is good for PR either.
Oh, it's all bad for PR.
all bad.
Yeah, for sure. Even for smaller organizations, right? So,
For the sort of small mid-sized business owners or people who are in the SMB space, if there's sort of one or two elements in which they should or questions they should be asking themselves about how they can start building a security program, even some actionable tips, where could they start?
right. So if we're looking at the privacy piece, I think there are three things that organizations should be asking themselves. They should be asking themselves, what personal information are we collecting, right? Are we collecting sensitive information? The GDPR has a special categories of information. We have sensitive data in our Canadian legislation. Are we processing sensitive data, right? So actually create a list of the information that we're collecting. What are we doing with it? How are we using it? And who are we sharing it with? And then the next thing that an organization needs to do, find somebody to be responsible for the privacy management program. And you know what? Don't be unfair about it. Don't say to somebody who already has a full-time job, oh, by the way, you're going to take on, can you just do this off the corner of your desk, right? It's hugely important, and we could be fined, and all these things could go terribly wrong. It's a high-risk area, but we just like you to take that on top of what you're doing already. And then provide some resources for the individual to actually do their job, provide some support, and then tell the organization, tell everybody, this is what we're doing. This is how we're going to be spending the next 6 months or whatever it is. It's going to be a piece we're going to be looking at. We're going to be talking about it. Because I think you asked, Dominic, what does success look like?
Yeah.
For me, what success looks like is when staff is coming to the privacy officer and saying, we're going to be doing this thing over here. We're going to be building this app. And actually, we kind of think there might be an issue because we're collecting what we think is personal information, or hopefully what they know is personal information because they've done the training.
Right.
They already understand it, right? But are they coming to the privacy officer and asking questions? Are they coming to the person who's in charge of security and saying, you know what? This doesn't seem right. I don't feel good about this. We should be doing something different. That, to me, is success, and it takes some time. It doesn't start that first day when you appoint your privacy officer and say, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. It takes some time, but that, to me, is success.
That's awesome. Cindy, thank you so much for taking time to come in studio, chat with us, and absolutely kill it. So you did an awesome job. We really enjoyed that convo.
I loved being here with you guys. Thank you so much,
Thank
Christian
you.
and Dom. It's been amazing. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.
Okay, I'm back in this guest chair here. I want to ask you, what was the number one thing that you got out of this conversation? I mean, for me, it was that idea of GDPR regulation and the fact that not only can they give you huge fines with big teeth, but they can actually shut down your operations, which is a pretty sobering thought.
Absolutely. And I think the thing I really love most, which Cindy was talking about, was, again, that piece of privacy by design and security by design. When you start and plan your organization or whatever product thing you're developing with that in mind, you end up with a much more robustly secure and private entity than something if you try to retrofit that. So Cindy was just fantastic about laying that out.
Completely agree. I really enjoyed that conversation. We are going to be back next Monday. Check out our other podcasts on conversationsthatmatter.tv.